New York never truly sleeps. But at this hour, the city felt still, not in rest, but in a hush that held its breath. High above the glowing veins of traffic, behind the tinted glass of the 52nd floor, a man stood frozen. Kyle Rivenhart, a name that commanded boardrooms, built empires, and silenced rivals. But tonight, none of that mattered. His shoulders were squared, but the weight pressing down wasn't from work. His reflection stared back at him in the glass, sharp-suited and poised, the image of success. Yet beneath that surface, something had finally cracked. On the desk behind him, a frame faced away from the door. He didn't let many people into this office. Fewer still ever touched that photo. And no one, not even his wife, knew the story behind the girl in it. Her name was Nova. 18 years of guarded memories stared back at him from that captured moment. A painting tucked under her arm. That quiet smile he never forgot. He could still hear her voice as a child, curious, soft, hopeful. And now, she was gone. Not missing in the traditional sense. Not kidnapped. But lost in a way that left him no roadmap, no blueprint. Just guilt and silence. If you've ever had to choose between love and legacy, you know Cale's pain. Hit like if you've ever made a hard choice. And stay with me, because this story changes everything. He pressed a hand against the glass. How did he let it come to this? This wasn't about a company or control. It was about a promise he'd once made in a hospital hallway when he was just 21. Back when his suit didn't cost more than some people's cars. Back when he still believed he could keep every part of his world separated and safe. But life doesn't wait for clarity. And secrets, they keep score. She wasn't mine by blood. But the moment I saw her, I knew I couldn't walk away. Have you ever kept something from someone you love, thinking it was for their own good? I told myself I was protecting everyone, my daughter, my marriage, my name. But silence builds walls, and eventually, those walls fall. Stay with me, because secrets don't stay hidden forever. And when mine surfaced, everything broke. Kyle moved back to the desk. The polished surface reflected the photo again, like it refused to be ignored. A quiet knock echoed at the door. He didn't answer. He couldn't. His phone buzzed. The name on the screen made his stomach twist. Isolde, his wife, pregnant with the child she thought would be their first. She didn't know the truth. Not fully. Not until 2 days ago. Now she did. And Nova. She'd heard it all in a moment never meant for her. He hit the side button, silencing the screen. He'd spent a lifetime building a world that appeared flawless. A world he controlled down to the smallest detail. But she was gone, and no amount of control could bring her back. He walked to the cabinet across the room, a sleek, locked drawer he hadn't opened in years. Inside, a faded envelope, the edges soft from time. He pulled it out. It was the first drawing Nova ever gave him. Crayons on thin paper, a crooked sun, a stick figure with a tie, and 3 words in barely legible handwriting, for my dad. His throat tightened. She'd been 5. Her caretaker had smuggled it to him during one of his hidden visits to her boarding school. He remembered sitting in his car afterward, staring at it for hours, knowing he could never hang it on his office wall like other fathers did. He'd chosen secrecy. Back then it seemed noble, clean, safe. But safety is often the lie we tell ourselves to avoid courage. Behind him, the city pulsed. Somewhere out there, Nova was alone. Again, he replayed the moment she walked away. She didn't scream, didn't cry. She just looked at him, like someone who'd spent her whole life waiting for something she now realized would never come. Recognition, truth, a name. And then, she was gone. He placed the drawing on the desk beside the photo. Side by side, the child she had been, the woman she was becoming. Isolde had asked him, "How could you keep something like this from me?" He didn't have an answer, because the answer was cowardice, wrapped in logic. Because the answer was, he didn't want to lose anyone. But in trying to protect everyone, he might have lost them both. He sat down. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about numbers or quarterly projections. He wasn't thinking about shareholders or strategy. He was thinking about Nova's voice on the phone, the last time she called him Dad. He hadn't heard that word in days. He wasn't sure he ever would again. I built walls around my life to keep it clean. But the moment you separate love from the truth, you don't build peace, you build loneliness. His eyes drifted to the skyline again. Lights flickered across windows, lives unfolding, choices being made. He wondered how many people out there were hiding something. He wondered how many believed they were doing the right thing by pretending. He'd done that. Now he was sitting in a room full of silence, holding a drawing that used to mean hope and now felt like punishment. He reached for his phone again. No new messages. He opened his voice recorder, clicked record, spoke, not to anyone who could hear him now, but to the one person he'd failed to say the truth to when it mattered most. Nova, I don't know where you are, but wherever this finds you, I need you to know something. You were never my mistake. You were my courage. I just didn't know how to be brave enough to fight for you in the daylight. A pause. Then he hit stop, saved the file. He didn't know if she'd ever hear it, but it was the first honest thing he'd said in days. And maybe that was the beginning of something better, or of consequences finally catching up. Either way, it had started. The silence had been broken. 10 years earlier, the hospital hallway smelled like cheap soap and cold metal. Kyle sat alone on a bench near the end of the maternity ward, elbows on his knees, hands folded so tightly his knuckles had gone pale. He hadn't planned to come here, not tonight. But when the call came, short, panicked, followed by silence, he knew he had to. They hadn't spoken in months, not since the last time she pushed him away. Her name was Marin. She'd been his friend since childhood. Not a romance, not exactly, but someone who once knew him better than he knew himself. He watched her unravel slowly over the years, skipping college, losing her job, falling in with people who used her up and left nothing behind. She always said she was fine, always said he didn't need to worry. He worried anyway. Now she was gone. Her body had given up just hours after delivering a child she never expected to have. No one came to claim the baby. No family. No partner. No plan. The nurse had explained everything calmly, kindly. The child has no listed guardian. Kyle hadn't answered. Not right away. Instead, he stood up, walked slowly to the nursery window, and stared. Rows of swaddled infants. Soft breathing. New beginnings. But one lay alone in the far corner. No flowers. No name card. That was her. He didn't know why he stepped into the room. Didn't think about what he'd say. Didn't know how to hold a baby. But as soon as he did, something changed. Her eyes were shut. Her tiny hand curled around the edge of his sleeve. Her body stilled in his arms like she'd been waiting for him. Something inside him, something he hadn't felt in years, woke up. Not out of obligation, not guilt, but something deeper. He knew it in that moment. She wasn't just someone else's daughter. She was his to protect. He didn't sleep that night. By morning, the paperwork had already begun. Emergency custody. Legal consultation. Private documents prepared through the firm his family always used. The nurse asked him one last time, "Are you sure?" He was only 21. Single. No partner. No public explanation. He didn't hesitate. "I'm sure." Kyle brought her home to the apartment he rarely used. Hired the best private care money could buy. Moved meetings. Cleared days from his schedule. Spent hours just watching her sleep. He named her Nova. A name she could grow into. A name with light in it. The silence of his penthouse was different now. Not lonely, not sterile, but filled. With soft coos, bottle feedings, lullabies from a music box he bought at a corner shop. He learned how to swaddle, how to burp, how to hold her when she cried without panic in his chest. At night, she rested against him on the couch, small as a heartbeat. He hadn't told anyone yet. Not the company, not his family, not even the media. Just one person. 3 weeks later, he sat across from his adoptive father in a quiet country club lounge, facing a silence more hostile than words. "You've lost your mind," the man said flatly. Kyle didn't answer. His mother stirred her tea once, then set the spoon down without drinking. "You think the board will allow this?" His father continued. "An unmarried man, a child out of nowhere, and no mother in sight. Do you know what this will do to your position?" "She's mine," Kyle said simply. "You're barely out of college. You're being groomed to lead, not to play house." Kyle looked down at the birth certificate folded neatly beside his drink. His name on the line that mattered. Her name where it now belonged. "She has no one else. Send her to a family. There are good families, quiet ones. We'll cover everything. No shame in that." He picked up the papers slowly. slid it back into his coat. "I'm not giving her away." His mother finally spoke. "If you insist on this, Kyle, you'll do it quietly. No photos, no statements, no trace. You want to be a parent, do it outside of public view. And if I don't," his father's gaze hardened, "then you'll walk away from everything we've built for you. Would you risk your entire future for a child that's not your own by blood? Comment yes or no below. Let's talk about what love means when no one's looking." Kyle stood in the elevator that night, Nova sleeping against his chest. The doors opened to his floor, and the sound of the city floated in, distant, hollow. He kissed her forehead and whispered, "No one will ever hurt you. Not while I'm breathing." He meant it. And from that night on, she was no longer hidden in his heart. She was his reason. Even if the rest of the world never knew her name, the world saw Kyle Rivenhart as a young visionary. Barely out of university, he was already making waves in corporate circles, poised to take over Rivenhart Industries, already sitting in high-level strategy meetings with a sharp mind and colder eyes. But no one knew that in the quietest corners of his life, he was something else entirely. He was a father. Nova grew quickly. By the time she was 3, she had developed an early love for sketching, crayons across glossy paper, ink-stained. Fingers, her drawings scattered across Kyle's apartment like breadcrumbs to a life no one else was allowed to see. He never missed her birthdays. He never missed a single recital, though he always stood in the back, behind tinted windows where no one could spot him. He was always present, but never visible. When she turned 5, he enrolled her in the finest boarding academy outside the city, a school with impeccable credentials, discreet staff, and strict privacy contracts. It broke him to do it, but the threats hadn't stopped. His father's warning remained firm. If she becomes a public liability, the board will respond. So he paid for safety. She had everything: private tutors, creative mentors, a full-time caregiver Kyle trusted like family. Letters came often, small, hand-drawn envelopes filled with colorful ink and childlike spelling. He kept every one of them in a drawer in his office. His personal staff was sworn to silence. The school signed non-disclosure agreements. The legal structure he built ensured that on paper she was linked to a guardian. Trust, one that just so happened to have full access to his personal wealth. But none of that replaced what he wanted most, to live in the open. She knew him only as Mr. Kale when he visited. That was the rule. Even at 6, she asked, "Why can't I call you what I want?" He'd knelt beside her once and said gently, "Sometimes love is the strongest when it's quiet." She didn't understand. He didn't expect her to, but that didn't make it any easier. Years passed. Nova became bright, observant, increasingly curious. Her letters changed in tone. Less doodles, more questions. "Why don't you stay longer? Will I ever meet your wife someday? Can I come home with you, even just for a weekend?" Kyle answered them with care. He never lied. But he always left enough room for truth to stay out of reach. He watched from a distance as she built a personality all her own. Sharp-witted, quietly expressive, she painted more than she spoke. Her room at school became filled with canvases of cityscapes she'd never walked through. One of them, a portrait of a tall man standing beside a shadow, nearly brought him to his knees. She was beginning to understand, and he was running out of time. The deeper he stepped into the world of business, the more impossible it became to maintain both lives. Rivenhart Industries grew rapidly under his influence. New acquisitions, international ventures, a growing media presence. He gave polished interviews, sat on panels, attended private dinners, smiled for the press, all while his daughter was being tucked into bed by someone else. On one occasion, he stood across the street from her school chapel during a winter ceremony. Snow lined the rooftops. Inside, Nova sang with the rest of her class, soft voice, hands folded neatly, face lit by warm light. She didn't know he was there, but she looked toward the door once, just once, as if searching for him, as if hoping. Kyle turned away before she could see the outline of him in the shadows. He told himself it was for the best, but even then, something in his chest fractured. One night, as he walked through his apartment alone, he found himself pausing at the bookshelf in his private study. He reached for one of Nova's earliest drawings, the first time she'd painted both of them together. He ran his hand across the paper. Her handwriting had improved since then. Her style had evolved. Her questions had deepened. But the ache. That stayed the same. He poured himself a glass of water and sat down in the leather chair by the window, looking out over a city full of faces. None of them knew him as Dad. Only one person in the world did, and she was starting to wonder if that role was real. Nova turned 9 the same week Kyle secured a major international contract. That pushed Rivenheart Industries into the global spotlight. His name began appearing on magazine covers. Analysts called him the future of modern enterprise. He flew home late that night, removed the tie he'd worn for 36 straight hours, and sat alone on the kitchen floor of his penthouse, Nova's birthday card unopened in his lap. She'd drawn a small family of 2. No background, no setting, just a man and a girl holding hands outlined in soft gray pencil. He had read somewhere that children draw what they miss. He set the card down and leaned against the wall. The silence around him wasn't quiet, it was empty. Nova's absence lingered in every room, and yet her presence lived in every drawer, every hidden photo, every quiet detail he refused to let anyone else see. He could fly halfway across the world to close a deal, negotiate in 5 languages, and calculate projections down to the decimal. But he couldn't answer one simple question from his daughter. Why can't I ever come home with you? That year, her letters grew shorter. More questions. Fewer drawings. By 10, she stopped asking to visit. She started signing her name with just an N. Kyle tried to compensate. He paid for advanced art instruction, hired a private mentor to guide her creativity. When she mentioned she liked a certain color of acrylic, he had it custom shipped from Japan. But gifts are not answers, and she never asked for more supplies. She wanted presence, not perfection. One afternoon, after reviewing quarterly reports, Kyle found himself looking out his window, the one that overlooked the city skyline, and imagined what it would feel like to stand next to her and explain what each building meant, what each light represented. Instead, he opened a drawer. Inside, a sealed envelope addressed to Nova, in his handwriting. A letter he wrote on her first birthday, a promise meant to be read when she turned 18. He hadn't read it since. He didn't dare now, because he wasn't sure it still held the truth. There was a moment, a fleeting one, when Kyle considered walking away. He had enough, more than enough. He could sell his stake, disappear into a quieter life, buy a home near Nova's school, be the man she saw in her drawings. But with every passing year, stepping away meant leaving behind something he'd spent his life chasing. And he'd convinced himself it was for her future too. If he could just build enough, she'd never want for anything. He confused protection with absence. He confused duty with delay. And in doing so, he carved out a life where the person he loved most had no nameplate on his door, no seat at his table, no trace in the photographs sent to the press. One day, Nova sent him a message through her caretaker. It simply read, "Do secrets still count if they're about love?" He didn't respond right away, not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't know how to answer honestly without breaking apart the structure he'd built to keep her safe. The answer he wanted to give was, yes, they count more. His father passed away shortly after Nova's 12th birthday. The company fell fully into Kyle's hands. The public hailed him as a legacy leader, a man of innovation, vision, strength. No one mentioned what he lost. No one asked what he'd given up to get there. And no one knew that just hours after the funeral, Kyle sat alone in his study, reading through Nova's old letters one by one. By then, her handwriting had matured. Her voice on the page carried more hesitation. She didn't call him Mr. Kyle anymore. She'd begun signing with just a dot. He visited her school one final time before her 16th birthday, a private ceremony for an academic award. She gave a speech, poised and clear. He watched from the upper balcony, away from view. After the ceremony, he waited by the gate. She didn't see him at first. When she did, she paused. They talked, briefly. He handed her a wrapped journal. Inside it, a blank first page, except for a note. "For all the things you'll create, and for all the pages I wish I could have filled with you." She smiled. Soft, faint, not bitter, not angry, just distant. She hugged him, briefly, and when she stepped back, she said, "It's getting harder to pretend I don't exist." That night, Kyle returned to the city. He looked out through the glass wall of his office, the skyline stretching like a monument to ambition. His reflection stared back, polished, composed. But behind his eyes, a quiet vow returned. "No one will ever hurt you, Nova, not even me. Not again. He wasn't sure how he would fix it. He wasn't even sure if it could be fixed. But one thing was certain. The silence was starting to break. The media called him untouchable. By his late 20s, Kyle Rivenhart had become the name everyone whispered in boardrooms and splashed across finance headlines. Rivenhart Industries was no longer a family legacy. It was his machine now, efficient, expansive, borderless. But in the chaos of his ascent, he lived quietly. No interviews outside of business, no appearances unrelated to strategy, no guests in his private residence. He kept 2 lives, until one evening changed that. The event was held in an old concert hall repurposed for fundraising, a discreet gathering for hospital donors, low publicity, high influence. Kyle didn't want to attend. He rarely went anywhere without an agenda, but one of his mother's final requests before her passing had been to support the pediatric wing she once championed. So he went, and that's where he saw her, not center stage, not commanding the room. She was reviewing a silent auction table near the exit, adjusting a frame that had slipped sideways. Graceful, focused, unbothered by the eyes around her. Isolde. He didn't speak to her that night, but he noticed she didn't scan the room for opportunity like others did. She wasn't posturing for access. She looked as if she had better things to think about than someone else's spotlight. That alone made her unforgettable. They crossed paths again 2 weeks later. A private gallery showing. She was there on behalf of her mother's foundation, something to do with rare art preservation. Kyle had come for the artist. Or so he told himself. Their first conversation lasted just 10 minutes, but it felt unhurried. She challenged his thoughts without ever raising her voice, asked questions that made him rethink his answers, listened in a way that made silence feel like part of the dialogue. He left with her name echoing in his mind, and for the first time in a long while, the noise of his world seemed to fade behind her voice. Their meetings became intentional. A walk after a conference, a shared ride from a rain-delayed gala dinner. Coffee turned into long conversations that lingered until sunrise. It was never rushed, never forced. Their connection was built slowly, like 2 people tracing the outlines of each other's lives with care. Kyle never brought her to the penthouse. Not for months. He kept her separate, not out of disrespect, but preservation. Because even as their bond deepened, one part of him remained locked behind a door she never touched. Nova. He told himself it was too soon, that telling her now would only complicate what they were building. He told himself. Later, when he finally took her hand at a private garden opening and called her his partner in front of colleagues, it wasn't for the headlines. It was because in that moment he knew she didn't see him as the empire he ran. She saw him as the man he could still become. Kyle proposed 8 months after their first meeting. There was no public spectacle, no photographers, just a quiet rooftop, a folded letter, and a simple question. Isolde said yes before he finished asking. They married the following spring. The ceremony was small, carefully curated. No press, only close connections and long-trusted staff. Photos released to media were limited, controlled. A few handshakes, a smile or two. The real memories were captured privately. Isolde in a pale, simple dress that moved with her instead of wearing her. Kyle in a dark suit that felt less like armor for once and more like home. They stood under low lighting, holding hands like they'd done it for years. There was no orchestra, no announcement, just a promise exchanged in silence. They moved into a property on the edge of the city, not as high as Kyle's penthouse, not as polished, but more lived in. A place where mornings began with shared silence over coffee and evenings ended with books left open beside each other on the couch. He kept his office downtown. But home began to mean something again. Isolde filled it with warmth he didn't realize he'd needed. No pretense, no performance, just space to breathe. But there was still a drawer in Kyle's private study that remained locked, and within it, letters, drawings, and one small photograph of a girl with dark hair and quiet eyes. He told himself again. Later, in the first year of their marriage, Kyle found something he didn't know he was searching for: steadiness. It wasn't a sweeping romance with grand gestures. It was better than that. It was quiet mornings with shared routines, grocery lists written on the kitchen chalkboard, arguments that ended with understanding instead of distance, laughing at each other's half-burnt dinners and leaning into silences that didn't need to be filled. Isolde wasn't impressed by power. She wasn't interested in his board meetings or portfolio expansion unless he invited her in, and even then, she offered thoughts without trying to impress. Her presence softened the edges of his world. He hadn't felt that in years. But even in their peace, a quiet ache began to form. It started with an offhand remark, Isolde saying she'd been more tired than usual. They laughed about it, blamed it on too much wine and too little rest. But when months passed with nothing changing, the laughter faded. They tried not to name it. When the first test came back inconclusive, they said nothing. When the second test came back with terms that felt clinical and heavy, they stopped pretending. They began the process, consultations, appointments, adjustments. Kyle cleared entire weeks from his schedule. He canceled 2 major speaking engagements without giving a reason. Isolde never cried in front of anyone, not even him, but sometimes he'd find her sitting on the floor in the guest room that was meant to become a nursery, staring at the empty corners like they whispered things only she could hear. She smiled when he walked in, always. But some smiles are worn like armor. He hated how helpless he felt. He could solve problems. That's what he did. That's who he was. But this wasn't a problem. It was a wound neither of them could close. They grew quieter, not distant, but inward. Some nights they lay beside each other in bed, fingers lightly intertwined, both awake but neither speaking. And in those moments, Kyle thought of Nova. She was 16 now, old enough to know what absence felt like. Too old to believe that silence was care. She had reached out once, a short message, simple and clear. Are you okay? Haven't heard from you in a while. He never responded. Not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't know how to be both things. The husband who was trying to carry his wife through grief, and the father who had quietly abandoned the child he promised never to let go of. Isolde brought up the idea of adoption once over tea, as though testing the water. Maybe there's another way, she had said softly. Maybe we were meant to be parents in a different form. Kyle didn't answer, not because he disagreed, but because the irony cut too deeply. She had no idea that he already was a parent, that he had been one for 16 years, that while she mourned what might never be, he mourned what already was. He stood in his office later that night, holding one of Nova's early sketches, a small, hurried drawing of what she once called home. He'd kept it hidden in a folder behind legal files. It showed 2 figures, one tall, one small, a sun in the background, a garden with uneven flowers. She must have drawn it when she was 7, back when she still believed someday meant something. The guilt grew louder, not because of what he'd done, but because of what he hadn't done. He hadn't told the truth. Not to Nova, not to Isolde, not to himself. A few weeks later, Isolde came home with a slight spark in her step. She'd visited a new clinic. The specialists gave them hope, a different treatment, a new approach. Kyle wanted to share in her relief. He tried, but deep inside, he knew, even if they did have a child together, part of his story would remain fractured unless he faced what he'd hidden. He stood outside Nova's school one morning, unsure why he'd driven there. He didn't get out of the car. He just watched from across the street as students exited through the main gate. He didn't see her. He didn't expect to, but being that close enough to remember how her voice once sounded when she said thank you through a shy smile, made something inside him tighten. He left a sealed envelope at the school office before he drove away. No return address, just a message inside. Happy birthday, Nova. I haven't forgotten. I never will. The new treatment worked. Isolde's health began to shift, subtle at first, a faint glow in her cheeks, a steadier rhythm in her body. Then, confirmation, 2 red lines, 1, heartbeat, and then 2, pregnancy. KL sat beside her during the appointment, the doctor's voice a distant hum, the ultrasound screen showing a flickering pulse that didn't yet have a name, but already had a home. Isolde squeezed his hand with tears she didn't try to hide this time. I didn't think we'd ever, she whispered, unable to finish. He kissed her temple and said nothing. It should have been a perfect moment. But part of him was elsewhere, not out of doubt, not fear, but the rising ache of a question he hadn't allowed himself to ask. What happens now? To Nova? That evening, they had dinner by the window. Isolde rested her hand over her stomach like a quiet promise. Kyle watched her carefully, the lightness in her eyes, the peace she hadn't felt in years. He should have told her then. The words reached his throat. Ready, waiting, but he hesitated. He didn't want to dim her joy. He didn't want the past to haunt her now. So he swallowed the truth again. Another day, he told himself. After the baby. After things settled. But the more he delayed, the heavier it became. Nova's birthday was 4 days later. He knew it from memory. He didn't need a calendar reminder. He never had. Every year, no matter how hectic his schedule, he always found a way to acknowledge it. A letter, a gift, a late-night call. He never missed it. Until now. The morning of her birthday, Kale was in a planning session with his legal team, outlining changes to the company's global structure. A partner mentioned a new charitable trust in his wife's name. Another offered congratulations again on the pregnancy. Kyle nodded, replied on cue, made the necessary comments. But something inside him felt wrong, uneasy. By the time he got back to his office, the sun had dipped behind the skyline. He opened his drawer. The letter he wrote to Nova the week before was still sitting there, unsent. He stared at it for a long time, then glanced at the time. It was nearly midnight. He'd missed it. No call, no message, no sign. The one day that was hers. And he let it pass like any other. He leaned back in his chair and let the silence close in. His phone sat face down beside him. His laptop blinked softly with unread notifications. He ignored them all. Instead, he closed his eyes and pictured her. The last time he saw her in person, she had just turned 16. She wore a loose scarf around her neck and carried her sketchbook like it was armor. She smiled when she saw him. Not with surprise, but with quiet patience, as if she'd been waiting and knew he would come eventually. And now, he didn't know if she still would. He picked up the letter. Read it again. It began with her name, her real name, and ended with 4 words he never said out loud anymore. I miss you, Nova. He folded it again and slipped it into his coat. He'd send it tomorrow, even if it was late, even if it couldn't undo what was already broken. The next morning, Isolde greeted him with sleepy eyes and a slow yawn, her arms wrapped around his waist as he stood by the kitchen counter. You okay? She asked. He nodded. Yeah, just didn't sleep much. She rubbed her hand gently across her stomach and leaned her head on his shoulder. We should start thinking of names, she murmured. I want something meaningful. Kyle placed a hand over hers and forced a smile. I'll make a list. But all he could think of was the name he'd already given, the one he hadn't spoken aloud in years, the one now echoing in his chest like a knock on a door he wasn't sure he still had the right to open. Isolde stood at the bathroom doorway, both hands covering her mouth, eyes wide, not in fear, but in disbelief. Kyle looked up from his coffee, caught off guard by the silence. She held out the test without saying a word. 2 lines. Clear, undeniable. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then came the sound of her breath catching, half a laugh, half a sob. Kyle crossed the room in seconds, pulling her into his chest as the weight of it all collapsed between them. I didn't think, she whispered into his shirt. He said nothing at first, just held her, tighter than he'd meant to, as if holding her was the only way to make it real. That afternoon, the doctor confirmed it, 6 weeks along. The pregnancy was strong, stable, healthy. Isolde cried again, this time from relief. Kale sat beside her, nodding through the medical terms, holding the scan photo like a fragile treasure. A heartbeat, a future, a beginning. They left the clinic hand in hand. For the first time in a long while, the weight they both carried felt lighter. The next few weeks passed in a blur of preparation. Isolde started a journal, not for herself, but for the child. Letters, memories, hopes. Kyle installed safety systems in the house himself, not trusting contractors. They picked nursery colors. They argued, gently, over names. And every time Isolde looked at him with soft eyes and whispered, "Can you believe it?" he said yes, even when a part of him wanted to say no, because I already have a child. And she doesn't even know this is happening. He began to have dreams again, not of the baby, but of Nova, always at a distance, standing in a hallway, sitting alone in a train, waiting beside a window with her sketchbook on her lap. She never spoke in these dreams. She just looked at him, and then turned away. He'd wake in the middle of the night, covered in sweat, Isolde breathing peacefully beside him, unaware. He didn't tell her, not about the dreams, not about Nova, There were moments, quiet, still ones, when he felt the urge to speak, to explain everything, to tell Isolde that before this miracle, he had already lived a different kind of parenthood, one filled with secrecy, yes, but also with love. But every time he tried to form the words, he saw her joy, how it made her glow, how it gave her back pieces of herself that she'd lost during the years of trying. He couldn't bring himself to take that away, not yet. Maybe after the first trimester, maybe after the baby arrived, maybe when it was safer. But the truth was, he was afraid. He told himself it was timing, that he would tell her after the next appointment, after the nursery was ready, after the first kick. But truth delayed is still truth denied. And somewhere deep inside, Kyle knew. The longer he waited, the more damage it would cause. A week before their second scan, he stood alone in his office, lights dimmed, watching a home video on his private device. Nova, age 4, sitting on the floor in oversized pajamas, surrounded by markers and construction paper. She looked up at the camera with wide eyes. "You're not supposed to film me when I'm making cards," she said with mock frustration. "I'm documenting your process," Kyle's voice replied behind the camera. She grinned, missing 2 teeth, and held up a heart-shaped card made of torn paper. "It's for you." He paused the video, closed his eyes, tried to steady his breath. That had been one of the happiest moments of his life, and no one knew it happened. Now, his wife was writing letters to a child she'd never met, and his daughter, somewhere out there, had no idea that she was no longer an only child. No idea that her name was being erased before it had ever been spoken out loud. The baby's second ultrasound was scheduled for a Thursday morning. Kyle cleared his calendar 2 weeks in advance, something he rarely did, even for major acquisitions. He arrived at the clinic before Isolde, sitting in the car outside, hands clasped loosely in his lap. He stared out the windshield, but didn't see the parking lot. In his mind, he was watching Nova at age 6, her arms wrapped around a stuffed bear, staring through the glass of the academy's main gate, waving at him as his car pulled away. It was the only way he could see her now, in fragments, flashbacks, glimpses behind the wall he built. Inside the clinic, the technician moved the sensor across Isolde's stomach, and the screen lit up with movement. Kyle's breath caught. There it was again, that flicker, that shape taking form. The heartbeat echoed faintly in the room, rhythmic and strong. Isolde squeezed his hand, tears running down her cheeks. He smiled, gently wiped them away. But he didn't cry. He couldn't, because even in that moment, pure, full, overwhelming, a corner of his heart felt heavy, like he'd left something behind in order to reach this place. And that something had a name. Over the next few weeks, the house changed. Isolde painted one wall in the nursery herself, soft, neutral tones. She played classical music through the speakers, saying the baby needed a refined taste from the womb. Kyle brought home books, medical, parenting, design manuals. He read in long stretches at night, pages open on his lap, though his mind often wandered. Some nights he sat in the nursery alone, staring at the small clothes folded neatly on the shelf. Other nights he stood in his study, Nova's unopened letters stacked in his drawer. The conflict was no longer quiet. It pressed against his ribs like a weight that refused to shift. He tried to silence it by being present, by doing everything right. Isolde never suspected. She only saw a husband devoted and steady, a man finally at peace. But Kyle was neither of those things. He was standing at the center of 2 lives he had crafted with care, yet couldn't bring together without breaking one. The dreams came back, but they were sharper now, more vivid. In one, he stood in the middle of an unfamiliar street, holding a child. In each arm, one new and quiet, the other older, eyes full of questions. Isolde stood nearby, watching. She didn't speak, neither did Nova, but the silence in the dream screamed. In another, he walked through a room filled with paintings. Each one was a scene from Nova's life, birthdays, first dances, school milestones, all ones he'd missed. He tried to lift one off the wall, but it burned his hands. He woke with his heart pounding, sweat beating at his neck. He didn't tell Isolde, just walked to the bathroom, washed his face, and stared at his reflection like it might offer clarity. One morning, while organizing paperwork in his office, Kyle found a small package, tucked between files, a gift Nova had given him when she was 13. A compass, because even when you're far away, she'd written on the tag, "You'll always find your way back to me." He hadn't opened it. Not because he didn't want to, but because he was afraid the message inside would be kinder than he deserved. Later that night, he sat at his desk and finally unfolded one of her old letters. It wasn't recent. It was from when she was 10. She'd drawn a cartoon version of him in the margin, broad shoulders, messy hair, standing, with his arms crossed beside a sign that read, "Best at hiding but still my hero." He exhaled, hands trembling slightly. He hadn't been a hero in a long time. He'd been a ghost in a tailored suit, and ghosts don't get to have families. The next morning, Isolde placed his hand on her stomach and whispered. She kicked. He felt it. A faint tap. A message from someone he hadn't met yet. He smiled. But for the rest of the day, he couldn't shake the echo of that drawing. Best at hiding. The dreams intensified. They no longer arrived once every few nights. They came in clusters, stirring him from sleep with a tightness in his chest and a cold rush through his veins. Each one held pieces of a truth he kept trying to avoid. In one dream, he stood inside a room lit only by a single lamp. The glow stretched across the floor, ending at a small puddle near the window. Nova sat in the corner, knees pulled to her chest, her wet hair sticking to her cheeks. She wasn't speaking. She wasn't reaching for him. She was crying. He tried to walk toward her, but the floor seemed to lengthen. The distance grew with every step. No matter how quickly he moved, she stayed just out of reach. Her shoulders trembled. Her breaths came too quickly. He tried calling her name. She didn't look up. In the dream, he opened his mouth to say something, anything, but no sound came out. Silence pressed in from every direction, suffocating. The only thing he could hear was her crying. And just before he reached her, he woke up. Every time. Heart pounding. Hands shaking. Isolde slept peacefully beside him, unaware that each morning he rose feeling further from the calm life he'd built with her. The pregnancy continued smoothly. Isolde's laughter returned. She made plans for a baby shower. She invited her sister to visit. She rearranged their bedroom twice, searching for the perfect placement for the crib. Kyle helped her paint tiny stars on the nursery wall one night. She teased him about his precision, saying he treated even decoration like a corporate project. He managed to smile, but while he painted the stars, he felt the weight of someone missing, not in the room, but in his life. Nova. He tried to distract himself with work, board meetings, expansion proposals, contract reviews. But even in the middle of a negotiation, he would find himself glancing at his phone as if expecting a message from her. She didn't message. She hadn't in months. He was the one who'd created the distance. Yet it unsettled him now that she had quietly stopped trying to bridge it. He'd made himself a stranger, and she had learned to treat him like one. One evening, Isolde found him sitting alone in the nursery, elbows resting, on his knees, staring at a small stuffed toy that lay on the carpet. "You okay?" she asked softly from the doorway. He straightened. "Yeah, just thinking." She walked in and sat beside him. "About work?" He nodded. It was the easiest lie, the safest lie, and she believed him, leaning her head on his shoulder as if he were a solid foundation, unaware that part of him was crumbling beneath the weight of the truth he refused to tell. That night, the dream returned, but this time, Nova wasn't alone. She stood beside a window, looking out at a blurred cityscape, her shoulders stiff, her hands clenched at her sides. She looked older, tired, detached. He called her name. She didn't flinch. He tried again. Nothing. Then she turned, slowly, and looked at him with eyes that held no warmth, no hope, just distance. Her lips parted, but no sound emerged. Instead, she raised her hand and pointed at the door behind him. He turned. A cradle stood there, empty. The dream ended there, abruptly, leaving him gasping as he sat upright in bed. The sheets were damp with sweat. His throat felt raw, and for the first time, he wasn't thinking about how to keep his secret. He was thinking about the cost of keeping it. Later that morning, he visited his office and opened the drawer where he kept Nova's letters. He pulled out one at random. It was short. "Do you ever think about me when you're busy? Or do I only exist in the spaces between your days?" His hands tightened around the paper. He had always justified the silence as protection. But protection without presence becomes abandonment, dressed as sacrifice. He placed the letter back carefully, then sat in the quiet for a long time. The truth he had buried for years was finally rising. It pressed against every part of his life, his marriage, his future, his sense of self. And deep down he knew, if he didn't tell Isolde soon, the lie he built to keep everyone safe would be the very thing that destroyed everything. Kyle rested his forehead against the cool surface of his desk, exhaling slowly. He didn't know where to begin. He didn't know how to pull the threads of two lives together without breaking both. But he knew this. Silence was no longer holding anything together. It was tearing everything apart. Can one lie meant to protect a loved one destroy everything? Share your thoughts below. Nova sat cross-legged on the wooden floor of her tiny apartment, surrounded by drying canvases. Brushes lay scattered across the table. A streak of cobalt blue stretched across her arm like a forgotten sentence mid-thought. She stared at the piece in front of her, a faceless figure standing at a window, looking out at something undefined. The figure's posture was familiar, reserved, composed, like someone used to watching instead of being seen. It wasn't labeled, but she knew who it was. Kyle. At 18, Nova lived in a world of color and silence. Art school had given her structure, deadlines, critiques, studio space, a routine, but not clarity, not answers. She painted things she couldn't explain in words. Long corridors, closed doors, a man's silhouette half turned away, reaching for something just outside the frame. Her instructors called it expressive, bold, honest. They didn't know the truth. They didn't know the man who raised her, never signed a card with Dad, never took her hand in public, never stood at her side without looking over his shoulder. She still received messages. They were brief, occasional, never enough. Proud of you. I saw your portfolio online. Beautiful work. Keep going. They were signed, K, nothing more. Her life had been lived in quiet corners, boarding schools, private tutors, controlled holidays. Even her caretakers changed often, rotated like schedules in a system she never fully understood. Kyle had been the constant, but only in the shadows. She remembered his voice best when it came from behind closed doors. His face most clearly when seen through car windows or across the lawn from a distance. He was always present, and never truly there. Nova had stopped asking questions years ago. Until now, she didn't know what changed. Maybe it was growing older. Maybe it was watching other students talk freely about their families, their roots, their memories, their grief, their joy, and realizing she didn't have any of that. Not fully, not honestly. She had art. She had hints. And she had a name that didn't quite fit. Rivenheart. She had never been allowed to use it. One night, she sat in her small kitchen with a cup of tea and a stack of old letters. They were from him, all handwritten. Some long, some no more than a paragraph. Some folded with crisp care. Others smudged, like he'd rewritten them several times before sending. One in particular stayed with her. If the world ever feels too heavy, just know, I didn't build it for you to carry. I built it so you'd never have to. It had made her cry when she was 15. Now, it made her angry. Because building a world in someone's name means little if they're not allowed to live in it. She searched his name online again. Kyle Rivenheart. The articles were endless. CEO, strategist, thought leader, charity work, business acquisitions, speaking engagements. And one piece that caught her eye, a recent photo of him standing beside a smiling woman in a cream-colored coat. Her caption read, Kyle Rivenheart and his wife, Isolde, prepare for the arrival of their first child. First, the word hit her like a punch. So clean, so absolute, as if she didn't exist. As if 18 years of memories had been deleted in a single sentence. She stared at the screen for a long time, then quietly closed the browser, and began packing a bag. The city hit her all at once. Nova stepped out of the station into a blur of motion. Horns, shoes slapping concrete, conversations overlapping, buildings that didn't end, just disappeared into the sky. For a moment, she stood still. It was louder than she'd imagined, but also somehow lonelier. No one looked at her. No one cared. She could have disappeared between the bodies, and the world would have kept moving. And in that indifference, there was freedom. No whispers, no hidden glances, no assumptions, just space. She found a small room on the Lower East Side. It wasn't much, a shared space with a student she barely knew, no kitchen, one window that creaked when opened, but it was hers. From there, she began to follow the trail. Rivenheart Industries was easy to locate. The building was impossible to miss, all sleek lines and mirrored glass, towering like a declaration. She stood across from it for 10 minutes, sketchpad in hand, not drawing, just absorbing. She imagined him inside. Kyle, not Mr. KL, not the name her caretakers used, not the title on legal forms or tuition receipts. Her father. She whispered the word under her breath, just to hear how it sounded. It felt foreign, but not wrong. Tracking him wasn't difficult. He wasn't hiding from the world, only from her. She made a list of places he was known to frequent. A gallery here, a private cafe there, public functions mentioned in articles, open events supporting causes attached to the Rivenhart name. She didn't want to ambush him. She didn't even know if she wanted to confront him yet. She just wanted to see him. In his world, the one she was never invited into. A week after her arrival, she found herself standing in front of an art foundation, hosting a student exhibition, partially funded by the Rivenhart family. Kyle wasn't there, at least not visibly, but as she stepped inside, the space felt familiar in a way that caught her off guard. Soft lighting, polished floors, intentional silence. It reminded her of her childhood visits to exclusive galleries, always under supervision, always brief. Kyle had taken her to one once, when she was 9. She'd held his hand the entire time, her eyes wide, asking about every piece, afraid to touch anything. He'd bought her a print that day, a watercolor of a lighthouse. She'd hung it by her bed for 5 years. She wandered the room slowly now, trailing the outer edge of the exhibit. Then she stopped. Midway through the collection, hung at perfect eye level, was a piece that made her chest tighten. It was one of hers, a charcoal and oil blend titled Distance, submitted last year for a student. Showcase, never claimed afterward, never expected to be chosen for anything. It showed a girl standing in a crowd, colorless against the movement around her. Her hands were open, reaching, not in panic, but quiet hope. It wasn't labeled with her full name, just N.R. Still, someone had found it. Someone had placed it here. Beautiful work. The voice came from just behind her, calm, warm, refined. Nova turned slightly. The woman was tall, with steady eyes and a presence that wasn't forceful, just complete. She wore no badge, no title, but moved like someone who didn't need introductions. Nova gave a small nod. "Thank you. Is it yours?" the woman asked, still facing the piece. "Yes. It says so much without forcing you to understand it all at once." Nova felt her throat tighten. "That's kind of the point." The woman turned to her then. "Do you have more?" "A few. I hope you keep going. You speak well through stillness." Nova didn't know how to respond to that, so she just said, "Thanks." They stood there for another moment, two strangers orbiting the same truth neither of them could see fully. Then a man approached the woman, whispered something. She nodded, excused herself, and walked away. Nova watched her go, her heart pounding. She didn't need confirmation, she knew. That was Isolde, the woman married to her father, the woman about to have his child, the woman who had just unknowingly complimented the daughter she'd never been told existed. Nova left the gallery a few minutes later, numb. She walked several blocks before stopping to sit on a bench outside a quiet bookstore. Her hands shook as she opened her sketch pad. She didn't draw Kyle, not this time. She drew the woman, and beside her, a child with closed eyes and open hands. That night, Nova couldn't sleep. She lay on her mattress beneath the narrow window, watching the city's moving lights play across the ceiling. Her sketchpad lay beside her, still open to the drawing of Isolde and the child. She'd added no caption, no signature. It didn't need either. What it showed was enough. A woman with calm eyes, a steady presence, and kindness in her voice. A woman who had looked straight at Nova, and didn't see her, not because she was unnoticeable, but because she'd been kept out of view, deliberately. She thought about leaving, packing up, vanishing quietly, telling herself she'd tried. It would be easier, less painful, but it would also mean accepting the same silence that had followed her for 18 years. And this time she couldn't. The next morning, she walked the length of the city without direction. She let the noise guide her, let the unfamiliar push her. Street vendors shouting, musicians playing with open cases, people rushing with coffee, with phones, with lives they weren't afraid to live out loud. Nova blended in, but she didn't feel small. She felt awake. She found herself in front of Rivenhart Industries again by early afternoon. The building looked the same, but she didn't. She stepped closer this time, until she stood just beneath its shadow. Her reflection stared back at her in the glass of the front lobby doors. Older, tired, but still standing. She pulled out her phone, typed Kyle's name into the search bar, scrolled past the recent headlines, past the interviews, past the public displays of his success. She focused instead on images, dates, patterns, and eventually she found what she needed. A fundraiser, 3 days from now, hosted at a downtown venue, partially sponsored by the Rivenhart Family Trust. No formal guest list. Public enough to attend without raising alarm. She saved the information to her notes, closed the phone, and walked away without looking back. Back in her apartment, she began preparing. Not clothes, not makeup, but questions. Simple ones. Why did you keep me away? Why didn't I have your name? Why do you get to live fully, while I had to learn how to disappear? She didn't know if she'd ask them all. She didn't know if he'd even give her the chance. But she had to try. Not for answers, not even for closure, but because she was done existing quietly in a life someone else had chosen to keep hidden. Later that evening, she received a message from one of her former caretakers. A brief note. No subject line, just a sentence. He's not the same lately. Nova didn't reply. She read it once, then again, and then she deleted it. This wasn't about caretakers anymore. This wasn't about the past they had all been paid to help maintain. This was about two people, one who stayed silent out of fear, and one who had lived in that silence long enough. She took out her paints again, not to calm herself, not to escape, but to express something she didn't want buried in another quiet corner. She painted a door, just barely open, light spilling through the crack, and in that light, a figure, hand outstretched, reaching, but not for someone else, reaching for herself. 3 days from now, she would go to that event. She would look Kyle in the eye, and whether he saw her as a ghost or a truth, that would be his choice. But she would no longer be invisible. Not to him, not to herself. It started with a name, one that Isolde had never heard from Kyle's mouth before. He was on a call in his home office, the door only partially closed. She wasn't trying to listen, not at first. She was passing by with the laundry basket, her mind elsewhere, until the name slipped through the space between them. Nova. Soft, careful, too deliberate to be casual. She froze. Kyle's tone was low, guarded. No, I'm not avoiding you. It's just complicated right now. Silence. Then you should have waited. I told you I'd call when I could. The room tilted slightly beneath her feet. She didn't move, didn't speak. She stood in the hallway for the rest of the conversation, hearing only pieces. No, I haven't told her yet. I know. She deserves better. You both do. And finally, I'll see you tomorrow. Same place. Isolde placed the basket down without realizing it. For several minutes, she stood completely still, hands at her sides, listening to her heartbeat echo in her ears. She wasn't the type to jump to conclusions. She never had been. But Kyle wasn't the type to hide things either. At least, she thought he wasn't. He stepped out of the office 10 minutes later, calm as always. She was already in the kitchen. He kissed her cheek, asked about her day, commented on the nursery paint drying faster than expected. Nothing was out of place in his voice, which somehow made it worse. She smiled. She answered, and inside, something began to shift. That night, while Kyle reviewed numbers on his laptop, Isolde sat beside him on the couch, casually scrolling through her phone. I've been thinking, she said. He looked up. About if we're going to raise this baby in a way that feels open and safe. Maybe we should start being more transparent with each other, too. Kyle paused. His gaze lingered just a second too long before returning to his screen. Of course, she smiled again, but it didn't reach her eyes. The next morning, Kyle left for an early meeting, or so he said. Isolde waited exactly 20 minutes, then got dressed and left, too. She didn't know what she expected to find. She had no plan. Just an address jotted down from the corner of a paper she'd found tucked into his briefcase the night before, scribbled quickly, as if he hadn't meant to keep it. It wasn't a business location, not one she recognized. She took a cab and told herself it was nothing, that it would be a misunderstanding, that she'd see him helping someone, supporting a former colleague, funding some discreet side project he hadn't mentioned. But even as she made excuses, her chest was tight. The cafe was modest, quiet, tucked between a bookstore and a flower shop. She arrived 15 minutes early, heart pacing, and sat outside across the street at a small table with a clear view through the windows. Kyle arrived not long after, alone. He didn't check his phone. He didn't look around nervously. He just sat, comfortable, familiar, waiting for someone. His old stomach turned. She kept her gaze fixed on the door. And then, Nova stepped inside. At first, Isolde didn't recognize her. Just a young woman, slim, composed, artistic in the way she carried herself. She wore a denim jacket with paint stains at the sleeve, her dark hair tucked behind her ears. She looked determined, but tired. Then Kyle stood and smiled, not politely, not distantly, with warmth, recognition, relief. He pulled her into a brief embrace, one hand on the back of her head. Nova's shoulders sank for just a second, like she was safe there, like she had been before. Isolde's throat tightened. Something deep inside her knew in that instant, this wasn't new. This wasn't recent. This was something old, something real, something hidden. She stood and walked away, not because she didn't want to see more, but because she already knew more than she could hold. Isolde didn't go home, not immediately. She wandered for hours, her mind spinning in every direction. People moved past her. Cars honked. Vendors called out prices. But none of it registered. All she saw was KL, rising to embrace a girl she'd never met with, a kind of tenderness she'd never seen him offer to anyone but her, a kind of knowing, a kind of history. She wasn't angry yet. She was something quieter, heavier, disoriented, like she'd been living in a house built on a floor that was just beginning to shift beneath her feet. When she returned home later that afternoon, Kyle was already there. He looked up from the dining table where papers were spread across a folder. His expression softened when he saw her. "Hey, you're back early." She set her bag down carefully. "I was nearby." He stood, walked to her, kissed her forehead like he always did. But today, she stepped back, just enough to make him pause. "I ran into someone today," she said, watching his reaction. Kyle blinked. "Oh, at a gallery showing last week. Student work, beautiful piece." Her voice was calm, too calm. The artist's name was Nova. The silence that followed wasn't long. But it was enough. Kyle didn't blink, didn't flinch, but she saw the shift in his eyes, the truth settling behind them. "You followed me," he said softly. "You lied to me," she replied, just as softly. The air between them changed. It didn't ignite. It collapsed. Kyle walked slowly to the window, hands in his pockets, jaw tight. "I was going to tell you." "When?" she asked. "Before or after the baby is born." He turned. "It wasn't about hiding her from you. It was about timing, protection. Everything I've done was to keep things from falling apart." "Falling apart?" Her voice cracked now. "Kyle, you have a daughter, a whole daughter, and I'm just finding out because I heard her name in a hallway?" He didn't answer, because there wasn't an answer that would make it better. Isolde crossed her arms over her chest. "How old is she?" 18. "Does she know about me?" He hesitated. "Yes. And she knows about the baby?" "I don't think so." "You don't think?" "I haven't spoken to her since before. It wasn't supposed to happen like this." Isolde sat down slowly, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. "You have a child," she said again, as if repeating it would help her make sense of it. "A whole life. And I've spent years beside you, crying over test results, wondering if I was enough. And you let me believe we were starting from the beginning." Kyle stepped toward her. "I didn't want to hurt you. You didn't want to be uncomfortable." That stopped him cold. The seconds passed. Outside, traffic moved. Inside, everything stood still. "She's not a mistake," Kyle said finally, his voice low. "I took her in when no one else would. I loved her before I understood what love really meant. I've failed her in ways I can't undo, but I won't let you turn her into something shameful." Isolde looked up at him, her eyes full of a pain that didn't need to shout. "I'm not asking you to be ashamed of her," she said. "I'm asking why you were ashamed to tell me." Kyle dropped into the seat across from her. He looked tired, Not in the way people look when they've worked too hard, but in the way people look when something they built has started to crack. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Then Isolde asked the question that had been forming since the moment she saw Nova in that cafe. Does she know you love her? Kael stared at his hands. I don't know anymore. Upstairs, in the envelope drawer of the nursery, lay the list of names they'd been working on. Names they hadn't chosen yet. Names for the future. But now the past had a name. And that name had changed everything. Outside the apartment, Nova stood on the opposite curb. She hadn't planned to follow them home. She hadn't expected anything. But she needed to see. She needed to know where he lived, what life he'd built, what kind of door she'd never been invited through. She watched the windows for a long time, then turned and walked away. Have you ever discovered a truth that shattered your world? Let's talk in the comments. Nova hadn't intended to follow him home. But after the cafe, after the way he smiled at her like the world had narrowed down to just that moment, she couldn't walk away. Not yet. She wanted to believe there was more than secrecy, more than half-meant letters and hidden visits. So she stood across the street from the apartment building. She didn't know how long she waited. Minutes, maybe more. She watched the windows, counted the floors, traced the outline of the balcony that overlooked the avenue. And then, as if the night itself made space for her pain, the second-floor window cracked open. Not fully, just enough for voices to spill through. She heard her name first. A whisper, almost missed. She's not a mistake. Kyle. She moved closer, pressed herself against the stone edge of the flower shop facade. I loved her before I understood what love really meant. His voice was firm, controlled, but not cold. I failed her in ways I can't undo. Nova's breath caught. She listened, because she couldn't not. Isolde's voice came next, calmer than expected. I'm not asking you to be ashamed of her. I'm asking why you were ashamed to tell me. Nova's chest tightened. Every sentence felt like a quiet confession not meant for her ears. Yet somehow, all about her. She knew it was wrong to stay. But what was more wrong was everything she'd wondered in silence. Finally being spoken aloud by people who still hadn't said it to her. Kael again. I didn't want to hurt anyone. But you did, Isolde said. And that's when Nova took a step back. The answer was clear now. This wasn't about her being forgotten. It was about her being hidden. Even from the people closest to him. Not because he didn't care, but because he cared in a way that still came with conditions. She walked to the corner and waited for the next light. She didn't cry. Not there. Not yet. She just felt hollow. Not like something had been taken, but like something had been confirmed. She'd asked him once, at age 14, why she didn't have his last name. He'd paused before answering, then said, because names can carry weight, and I want yours to stay light. At the time, it felt poetic. Now, it felt like deflection. She made it back to her apartment without really remembering the walk. The door clicked shut behind her. She leaned against it and stared at the chipped paint on the wall ahead. Then she pulled out her sketch pad. No brushes, no color, just pencil. She drew her hand, letting go of another. No tension, just release. Kyle stood by the window long after Isolde had gone upstairs. She hadn't stormed off. She hadn't screamed, but something had broken between them, the kind of break that doesn't echo but leaves dust in the air long after it's done. He stared at the streetlight flickering on the sidewalk below and wondered if Nova had been nearby. He had a feeling. She'd always been good at sensing moments, just like her mother. He walked to his study and opened the drawer where her letters were kept. One fell loose, unopened. He hadn't noticed it before. The date was from nearly a year ago. The handwriting was sharper, older. He opened it carefully. Inside, if I ever disappear, it won't be because I gave up. It'll be because I finally believe you weren't coming. He closed his eyes, set the letter down, and realized he'd built his life like a fortress, not to keep danger out, but to keep feelings in. And now, everything that mattered was slipping away on both sides. The silence wasn't protection anymore. It was punishment. Isolde stood in the nursery, her fingers brushing the edge of the crib they had assembled together just 2 weeks earlier. The soft beige walls, the folded blankets, the mobile Kyle had personally chosen. All of it felt like a set now. Staged. False. Her palm rested on her stomach. A small kick fluttered beneath her hand. She didn't cry. She just stood there, unmoving, like she was waiting for the part where the audience claps and the curtain falls. But there was no applause, no closing scene, only a strange growing silence where security used to live. Upstairs, Kyle sat in his office. The door was closed, not locked, but symbolic. He had replayed every sentence he should have said. How many times had he come close to telling her? At the wedding, on their anniversary, after the first miscarriage, before the first fertility consult, after she asked him what he feared most in life. Every moment had been an open window, and he had shut every single one. Isolde walked out of the nursery and into their bedroom. She opened their closet, ran her hand along his jackets, his shirts. There was a comfort in the texture, a cruel one. Everything about him was so composed, so tightly built, so intentional, and she had believed in it, in him, not just as a man, but as a partner, as a future father. Now, she wasn't sure what she believed in anymore. Her phone buzzed. A message from her sister. "How's our little fighter today? You glowing or still tired of people asking that?" Isolde stared at the screen, typed a reply, deleted it, typed again, deleted again. She placed the phone face down and lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling. There was no guide for this, no script for what to do when the man you share a future with forgets to mention the life he left behind. Kyle knocked once, gently, before stepping inside. She didn't look at him. He sat at the edge of the bed. "I know I have no right to ask anything from you right now," he began, his voice low, controlled. "But please, let me talk to you. Let me explain." She turned her head slightly, not toward him, just away from the ceiling. "Explain what?" she said. "That I'm the second chapter in a book I never knew had a beginning?" He flinched. Isolde sat up slowly. Her voice was calm but fragile, like glass under pressure. "I begged the universe for this baby," she said, her hand resting again on her belly. "I begged you to tell me anything that was weighing on you during those long nights when I cried myself to sleep, and you just held me in silence." She shook her head once. "Now I know why the silence felt so loud." Kyle leaned forward. "I was afraid," he admitted. "Afraid that if I told you about Nova, it would break something in you. That I'd lose you." "You broke something anyway," she whispered. He nodded. No argument, no defense, only shame. "You let me believe we were building from scratch," she said. "But we were building over someone else's shadow, over a daughter I might have loved if you had just let me." Her voice cracked, but she held it together. Kyle's eyes welled, but he didn't speak. Not yet, because nothing he could say would heal this rift in a single night. Isolde stood up slowly, brushing past him. "I'm going to stay at my sister's for a few days," she said. Kyle rose, alarm in his tone. "Please, Isolde." "Not forever," she said. "But I need space, from your silence, from this house, from everything I thought I understood." He didn't follow her, didn't try to stop her, because for the first time he understood, the damage wasn't from the secret itself. It was from the delay, from the years where truth would have been hard, but not fatal. And now, truth had arrived too late to prevent the collapse. Kyle stood outside Nova's apartment building for nearly an hour before he found the strength to press the buzzer. The entryway was dimly lit, the kind of place people passed without noticing. No security, no doorman, just a silent code panel and a faint humming from the old lights above. He pressed the button, waited, no answer. He tried again, still nothing. Then, as he turned to leave, the door clicked open. Nova stood inside the threshold. She said nothing, didn't smile, didn't scowl, just opened the door wide enough for him to pass. He stepped in slowly. The apartment was sparse, a mattress on the floor, 2 crates stacked as a bookshelf, and a fold-out table with brushes and paper scattered across it. The only warmth came from a small lamp in the corner, casting a soft glow against the unfinished canvas leaning on the wall. She sat across from him. He stood. The silence between them was thicker than before, not hostile, just layered in things unspoken for far too long. "I don't know where to begin," Kyle said quietly. "Try the truth," Nova answered. It wasn't sharp, just honest. He nodded, sat down. "I never meant for you to feel like a secret," he said. "But I was. She looked directly at him now. For 18 years. Kyle folded his hands in his lap. I thought I was protecting you, and her. From what? She asked. He didn't answer. Because what could he say? From judgment? From scandal? From being seen? Nova stood, walking slowly to the wall where a sketch hung, one he hadn't seen before. A girl on a bench, eyes closed, holding a birthday card she hadn't opened yet. Her posture said everything. Not sorrow, not rage, just waiting. Too long. Every birthday, she said, still facing the wall, I told myself this year would be different. That maybe I'd hear your voice instead of your secretary's. That maybe I'd get more than the same wire transfer and a message that said, stay focused, I'm proud of you. Kyle closed his eyes. I wanted to be there, he said. More than you know. But you weren't. She turned to face him again. And when you were, it was always in shadows, like I was something to be managed, not someone you were proud to love out loud. Kyle rose now, his voice trembling. I've made mistakes, Nova, so many. But I never stopped loving you. She didn't flinch. I know that, she said. But that's not the question, is it? He looked at her, puzzled. Nova stepped closer. The ache in her chest was no longer raw, it was settled. Still painful, but stable. She asked quietly, why wasn't I enough to be known? The silence that followed felt eternal. Kyle looked at her, really looked at her, and saw all the years she had spent wondering, not hating, not resenting, just asking herself that one relentless question. Why was she kept outside? Why did love have limits? Why did presents have terms? I was scared, Kyle said finally, of losing everything, the company, the board, my name, and in protecting your name, Nova replied, you erased mine. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She just stepped back. I'm not here for apologies, Kyle. Not right now. He wanted to argue, to explain, to collapse into a list of regrets. But he didn't, because something in her posture told him this was her boundary, and he'd already crossed too many. She walked to the door, opened it gently. You should go. Kyle nodded slowly. His throat was tight. He walked past her, then paused at the threshold. I'm proud of you, he said, without turning. She didn't reply. The door closed softly behind him, and Nova stood in the quiet, no longer waiting to be claimed. Kale stood outside Nova's apartment building for nearly an hour before he found the strength to press the buzzer. The entryway was dimly lit, the kind of place people passed without noticing. No security, no doorman, just a silent code panel and a faint humming from the old lights above. He pressed the button, waited, no answer. He tried again. Then, as he turned to leave, the door clicked open. Nova stood inside the threshold. She said nothing, didn't smile, didn't scowl, just opened the door wide enough for him to pass. He stepped in slowly. The apartment was sparse, a mattress on the floor, 2 crates stacked as a bookshelf, and a fold-out table with brushes and paper scattered across it. The only warmth came from a small lamp in the corner, casting a soft glow against the unfinished canvas leaning on the wall. She sat across from him. He stood. The silence between them was thicker than before, not hostile, just layered in things unspoken for far too long. I don't know where to begin, Kyle said quietly. Try the truth, Nova answered. It wasn't sharp, just honest. He nodded, sat down. I never meant for you to feel like a secret, he said. But I was. She looked directly at him now. For 18 years. Kyle folded his hands in his lap. I thought I was protecting you, and her. From what? She asked. He didn't answer. Because what could he say? From judgment? From scandal? From being seen? Nova stood, walking slowly to the wall where a sketch hung, one he hadn't seen before. A girl on a bench, eyes closed, holding a birthday card she hadn't opened yet. Her posture said everything. Not sorrow, not rage, just waiting. Too long. Every birthday, she said, still facing the wall. I told myself this year would be different. That maybe I'd hear your voice instead of your secretary's. That maybe I'd get more than the same wire transfer and a message that said, stay focused, I'm proud of you. Kyle closed his eyes. I wanted to be there, he said. More than you know. But you weren't. She turned to face him again. And when you were, it was always in shadows, like I was something to be managed, not someone you were proud to love out loud. Kale rose now, his voice trembling. I've made mistakes, Nova. So many. But I never stopped loving you. She didn't flinch. I know that, she said. But that's not the question, is it? He looked at her, puzzled. Nova stepped closer. The ache in her chest was no longer raw. It was settled. Still painful, but stable. She asked quietly, why wasn't I enough to be known? The silence that followed felt eternal. Kyle looked at her, really looked at her, and saw all the years she had spent wondering, not hating, not resenting, just asking herself that one relentless question. Why was she kept outside? Why did love have limits? Why did presents have terms? I was scared, Kyle said finally, of losing everything, the company, the board, my name, and in protecting your name, Nova replied. You erased mine. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She just stepped back. I'm not here for apologies, Kyle. Not right now. He wanted to argue, to explain, to collapse into a list of regrets, but he didn't, because something in her posture told him this was her boundary, and he'd already crossed too many. She walked to the door, opened it gently. You should go. Kyle nodded slowly. His throat was tight. He walked past her, then paused at the threshold. I'm proud of you, he said, without turning. She didn't reply. The door closed softly behind him, and Nova stood in the quiet, no longer waiting to be claimed. Kyle stayed in his office long after the sun had risen. The world outside moved on, people rushing to work, deliveries being made, conversations drifting through hallways, but his space remained still, untouched by anything except regret. He kept the childhood drawing in his lap, a simple sketch, a crooked castle, two figures smiling. Something inside him tightened each time he traced the faded pencil lines with his thumb. This wasn't a boardroom failure. This wasn't a public scandal. This was the loss of a relationship he had built in quiet moments and then weakened with silence. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes, struggling to find even one decision from the past that didn't feel hollow now. A soft knock disturbed the stillness. He straightened slightly but didn't look toward the door. Sir, a delivery just came for you, one of the staff members said from the hallway. No signature required. It was left at the front desk. Kyle didn't respond. The staff member placed the package on a side table and left. A small, rectangular parcel, wrapped simply, no message. Something about the shape made his breath hitch. He stood quietly and approached it with hesitant fingers. He unwrapped it carefully, then froze. Inside was a painting, not a recent one, not polished, more like something created in a single emotional rush, bold lines, rough strokes, deep shadows. It was a portrait of his office window, the exact angle, the exact frame, captured with uncanny precision, the place where he had once stood when he made the hardest decision of his youth, the night he picked up a newborn girl and promised her safety. A moment Nova should not have remembered, but somehow she had captured the feeling of it, isolation, fear, determination layered together. She had always been able to translate what people never said into color and shape. Kyle sank into the nearest chair. The painting rested in his trembling hands. It wasn't just artwork. It was a message. She wasn't disappearing out of spite. She was giving him a direction, a chance, a location hidden in memory, her way of saying goodbye, or maybe inviting him to find her. He didn't know which, but he knew he couldn't ignore it. He rose slowly, his movements deliberate, almost ritualistic. He carried the painting to his desk and set it down, adjusting it until it stood upright. His reflection appeared faintly in the varnished surface. Hollow eyes, a tight jaw, a man who built a life so guarded, even love had to knock before entering. He leaned forward, exhaling shakily. Where are you? He whispered. The city outside was loud, but the question felt like it cut through it all. He wasn't asking it to the world. He was asking it to himself, to the part of him that had waited too long to be brave. Isolde's footsteps sounded in the hallway. Her suitcase wheels rolled softly against the floor. She didn't open his office door, didn't call his name. She was giving him the same space she needed. The family he had wanted so desperately, the one he tried to piece together on his timetable, was now fractured. Not gone, but scattered. The baby kicked beneath her hand as she paused near the threshold. Not in pain, just aware, life continuing even when clarity did not. She whispered a goodbye, voice almost inaudible, then walked to the elevator. The doors slid shut. Back in the office, Kyle stood with both hands braced on the desk, staring at the painting. His voice, low and unsteady, broke the silence. "Nova, I should have chosen you out loud." For the first time, he admitted it fully. Not in thought, not in guilt, but in words, real words, the kind that couldn't be taken back. He picked up the painting again, studying the brushstrokes. Every line pulled him towards something familiar beneath its layers, a location, a memory, a place he hadn't visited in years. The cabin, his birth mother's old property, left untouched, abandoned in all ways except the emotional weight it carried. Nova must have found the address somewhere, and if she had gone that far, he couldn't stay here another second. Kyle grabbed his keys. No hesitation, no second thoughts, just movement, swift, decisive, unguarded in a way he hadn't allowed himself to be in years. He walked out of the office and through the lobby. Employees stepped aside, sensing something in his expression they couldn't name. He didn't look back, because the only direction left was forward, toward the daughter who had spent her life waiting for him to show up without excuses. New York didn't stop for anyone. Not for grief. Not for fathers searching for the daughters they failed. Not for sleepless CEOs roaming streets without an agenda. Kyle moved through the city like a man running out of time. The suit he wore the first morning was crisp. By the third, he looked like everyone else. Wrinkled collar, unshaven jaw, tired eyes hiding behind dark frames. He had sent his assistant home. Paused every meeting. Deferred every call. The company could wait. She couldn't. He began with the obvious, private investigators. The top 3 in the tri-state area were hired within hours. He shared Nova's full name, the one on the birth certificate no one had seen. Old school records. The address of the boarding school. Photographs from every stage of her life. Even the ones taken in secret. They scanned everything. Public transport data. Hospital logs. ATM withdrawals. Even gallery cameras in Lower Manhattan. Nothing. By day 5, Kyle stopped sleeping. He took his car through alleys and back roads he hadn't driven in years. He questioned school contacts, baristas, art students from Nova's part-time classes. He even slipped money to a street artist who once painted next to her. None of them had seen her. None of them remembered a girl with eyes like storm clouds and hands that smelled faintly of graphite and linseed oil. Flashbacks came without warning. She was 4, clinging to his leg as he left her dorm for the first time. She was 11, rolling her eyes when he corrected her brush grip. She was 16, whispering through the window of a car, "It's okay, I know you're busy," when he canceled another visit. He kept those moments close, but they tore at him. Because now he would give anything, absolutely anything, to go back and show up. By the end of the week, Kyle changed tactics. He called in favors. Old colleagues in the security industry. A former intelligence contact with access to tech few civilians could dream of. Facial recognition? Kyle asked. The contact hesitated. "It's invasive, Kyle, and not always reliable." "I don't need reliable," he said. "I need possible." Within hours, a quiet operation began. Subway cameras, intersection captures, art galleries' digital check-ins. Every pixel of the city was being scanned for her face. The silence between updates was brutal. Each hour felt like sand slipping through fingers. But the stillness, that deafening stillness, was shattered on day 9. A small package arrived at the Rivenhart front desk. No return address, no markings, just his name, written in ink that looked like it had bled slightly, as if touched by moisture or grief. The receptionist hesitated, then brought it straight to him. Kyle didn't open it immediately. He stared at it for several seconds. Something about it pulsed. He carried it into his office and sat down. His hands trembled. He peeled back the tape slowly. Inside, wrapped in plain paper, was a canvas no larger than a notebook. He unwrapped it and forgot how to breathe. The painting was of his office window, not just a representation, a recreation. The angle, the way the city lights spilled in at dusk, even the reflection of a chair behind glass. Every detail had been studied, felt, understood. It wasn't new. The paint had dried unevenly. It had traveled. possibly exposed to weather, judging by the faint warping along the edges. Nova had sent it. He didn't need confirmation. He knew. She had been watching, maybe not long ago, maybe from across the street, or maybe from memory. But this wasn't a goodbye. This was a signal. He turned the canvas over. No message, no signature. But in the bottom right corner, almost invisible, was the faint mark he'd taught her to include when she was a child. Not her full name, not her initials, just a symbol, 2 lines, a slash, and a circle. It meant, "I'm still here." Kyle stood up. He opened his drawer, pulled out a black leather folder that held family records, ones even his assistant didn't know about. Inside it, an old deed. The cabin. It all clicked. Her sudden knowledge of his past. The painting of the exact spot he'd made the decision to raise her. The only place she could have found mentioned in the documents left behind by his birth mother. She had gone there. It was remote, quiet, unlisted, which made it the perfect place for a girl raised in the shadows to disappear into. But now, he had a direction. The road stretched out like a scar. Kyle didn't take the company jet, didn't hire a driver. He took the wheel himself, one hand on the steering wheel, the other clutching the painting Nova had sent, wrapped in an old scarf and placed carefully on the passenger seat. Manhattan gave way to tree-lined highways. The sound of horns and crosswalk chatter faded into distant bird calls, the hum of tires over asphalt. Each mile north felt heavier than the last, not because of the journey, but because every stretch of silence gave his mind room to speak. He saw her, again and again, not the woman who left, but the girl she'd been. Tiny moments rose from deep memory. 6 years old, pulling at his sleeve. "Can I keep this one, Daddy?" While holding a half-finished sketch of clouds. 9, drawing on napkins during their secret lunch visits, asking if her eyes looked like his. 15, sending him letters during his company's IPO, always ending with, "You're still my biggest painting." They had built something, even in secret. He wasn't imagining it, and yet, silence had slowly eroded the bond until the frame of it remained, but not the center. He gripped the wheel tighter. The car's tires caught a crack in the pavement and jolted him back. Focus. She had gone somewhere quiet, alone, somewhere familiar enough to feel safe, but removed enough to stay hidden. She had always loved that cabin, even without ever seeing it. He once described it to her when she was 8, a story meant to calm her on a night she couldn't sleep. "It's small," he'd said. "Wooden. There's a porch that overlooks the sea. It smells like pine and old books. The kind of place no one can find unless they're meant to." He didn't know that his words had rooted in her, and now they had become a map. At a gas station in New Hampshire, Cale stopped. He filled the tank, checked the coordinates again. The property was listed under his birth mother's original surname. No official records had ever tied him to it directly. He had visited it only once, when he was 19, after finding a box of old photos. The place hadn't been touched in years, but the key had remained hidden behind a loose stone on the front step. It was the only location in the country no one associated with him. Perfect for someone who wanted to disappear. Quietly. Back on the road, Kyle let his thoughts spiral, not into panic but reflection. What would he say to her when he arrived? If she was even there, would she open the door? Would she speak? Would she cry? Or had he come too late? He imagined knocking and getting no answer. He imagined the porch light flickering on. But the thought that hit the hardest? What if she forgave him too easily? What if, after everything, she just folded into his arms? He didn't deserve that. Not yet. Not without hearing her pain in her own words. And still, he would fall to his knees if it meant getting even a sliver of her trust back. The highway narrowed. Trees lined the edge of the road like sentinels. Cale's phone had lost signal 20 minutes ago. It didn't matter. He wasn't turning back. The sun was beginning to dip behind the hills now, washing the sky in orange. He turned down the final stretch, a single-lane road that curved sharply before reaching the coastal edge. Each turn brought with it another memory, each shadow another doubt. But up ahead, finally, between 2 weather-beaten trees, stood a slanted mailbox. No name, no number, but he recognized it. The gravel crunched under his tires as he pulled in. The ocean lay just beyond the tree line, a silver sheet under fading light. And tucked into that line, still standing, still stubborn, was the cabin. Kyle parked the car. He didn't rush. He stepped out slowly, heart drumming loud enough to echo in his ears. The painting was tucked under his arm. He walked toward the porch, eyes searching for movement. No lights, no sounds, but on the porch, a pair of boots, small, worn, splattered with paint. His breath caught. She was here, or had been. He reached the step. His foot pressed against the stone he remembered. Still loose, still hiding the key. He didn't reach for it. Not yet. He just stood there, letting the weight of his choices settle. This was the moment. No more secrets. No more delay. Kyle raised his hand and knocked. 3 slow taps. He waited. Nothing. He pressed his ear closer to the wooden door, listening for movement. Still. Nothing. His fingers hovered over the knob. He could use the key. But something about entering without her knowing felt wrong. So he waited, and just as he considered knocking again, the door opened. A few inches, no more. She stood behind it, barefoot, paint on her fingers, hair pulled into a loose knot, strands falling over her face. No tears, no smile, just eyes, dark, sharp, cautious, the same ones that used to follow him at school gates. Nova. Kyle couldn't speak at first. His throat tightened, chest locked. The painting under his arm nearly slipped. Nova stepped back without a word, left the door open. An invitation. Kyle stepped inside. The cabin was as he remembered. Dust in corners, a crooked bookshelf, still standing, and the scent of salt air mixed with turpentine. Canvases leaned against walls, some blank, some filled with waves, rooftops, reflections of places that didn't exist but felt like memories. She hadn't fled to forget. She had come here to feel. She walked ahead of him into the small living room. Didn't sit. Didn't ask him to. She just spoke, finally. I didn't know if you'd come. Kyle swallowed. I wasn't sure you'd want me to. Nova didn't answer. Instead, she walked to one of the paintings and picked it up. It was of the school courtyard, the exact spot where he once hugged her after promising to be there for her birthday. And didn't show. You used to stand by the statue, she said, voice flat. You thought I didn't see you. He stepped closer. I didn't want to make things harder for you at school. You made things quieter, she replied. Not easier. The words stung more than she knew. Kyle looked down. I thought I was protecting you. Nova finally turned to him. And when were you going to protect me from silence? His eyes lifted to hers. Raw, direct. I was wrong, he said, voice low. I made you live in the shadows because I thought I was shielding you, but I was only shielding myself. She didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She let the weight of that truth settle. He moved toward the small table by the window, unwrapped the scarf, laid the painting she had sent him gently on the surface. I don't deserve this, he said. But it told me where to find you. She looked at the piece, said nothing. But the tension in her shoulders shifted, barely. She sat down across from him, hands clasped loosely in front of her. What do you want from me? She asked. Kyle took a breath. Not forgiveness, not yet. I want you to know I'm not hiding anymore, and I'm not asking you to come back. Just to hear everything. No more pieces, no more silence. Nova didn't move, but her eyes didn't look away. Outside, wind pressed softly against the windows. Kyle leaned forward. When I adopted you, I wasn't ready, but I knew I couldn't leave you. Everyone said I'd ruin my future. I didn't care. He paused. But I cared what they thought. Too much. I cared about status, power, the company. I let those things become reasons to hide you. Not because you were shameful, but because I was afraid, Nova whispered. Afraid of losing what? Kyle met her eyes. Of losing you, and of losing the version of myself I'd built to survive. Silence again. But not the hard kind, the kind where things start to shift. Nova looked down at her hands. I used to wait for your car on Saturdays. I thought maybe one day you'd bring me home, not just for visits, for good. Kyle blinked rapidly. I should have. You didn't. He nodded once. You're right. She stood, walked to the window, then said softly, I'm not here to punish you, but I needed you to come here on your own, without anyone forcing you, without an image to maintain. Just you. Kyle rose too. I came because I couldn't live another day not knowing if you were safe, if you still had enough reason to believe I loved you. She turned to face him, eyes glassy now, but no tears fell. I never doubted you loved me, she said. I doubted if you trusted me enough to love me out loud. Kyle stepped closer. I trust you now, and I'm not going to ask you to come back tomorrow, or even next week, but if you let me, I'll come back here, as many times as it takes. Nova looked at him for a long time, then nodded once, a small, subtle motion, but it was everything. They stayed there for hours, not speaking the whole time, not needing to. Kyle made tea in the small kitchen. The kettle hissed and clicked like it was remembering how to work again. Nova handed him a clean mug without a word. He took it as if it weighed more than glass. They sat at the small table beside the window, steam curling between them. Outside, the sky had turned navy blue. The sea beyond it was calm. Nova looked down into her cup. I never stopped painting, she said, even when I felt invisible, especially then. Kyle nodded. That was always your way of being heard. She glanced at him. It was my way of not disappearing completely. He stared out the window. I should have been there more, he said. Not in hidden ways, not just letters, not just holidays, but there, in your life. Nova looked down again. You were scared. Kyle nodded slowly. I was. There was no accusation in her voice anymore. Only a strange kind of acceptance. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But understanding, the kind that comes after long silence, when pain loses its sharpness and becomes something quieter. Nova stood and walked to one of the canvases near the fireplace. She turned it around. It was unfinished. Rough outlines, a sketch of 3 figures on a shore. One older, one younger, one still small and being held. Kyle stared at it. You painted this after you found out? Nova nodded. It was the first thing I touched when I got here. I didn't know what I was drawing at first, but it became us. He stepped closer, eyes locked on the smallest figure. I have a son now, he said quietly. He's only a few weeks old. His name is Leo. Nova blinked. A beat of silence. Kyle turned to her. He'll know about you, from the start. No secrets, I swear it. Nova didn't respond right away, but she didn't look away. She finally asked, does she know where you are, Isolde? I left her a message, told her I found the painting, that I was going north. Nova nodded again, more slowly this time. She seemed kind, she said. Kyle was surprised. You met her? Not really. Once, a gallery. She saw my work and complimented it, said it felt honest. Kyle swallowed hard. She doesn't know that yet, he said, that the artist was her husband's daughter. Nova's voice was quiet. She will. He watched her closely. You want to meet her? Nova hesitated. Then finally, one day, but not like a guest. Kyle understood. Not a guest, not a secret. A place, a part, a name spoken out loud. Night had fully set in now. Kyle helped light the old fireplace. The glow painted the cabin in orange and gold. He pulled out a blanket from the closet and offered it. Nova took it, folding it around her shoulders as she sank into the couch. He sat in the armchair nearby, careful not to crowd her space. They watched the flames for a long time, and then, softly, without turning, she spoke again. I don't know what happens next. Kyle answered. Neither do I. She added, I'm not sure if I'll come back to New York right away. Silence settled between them again, but it wasn't empty. It was full of things not yet healed, but finally seen, full of time lost and time still possible. Kyle leaned back, letting his body sink into the chair for the first time in what felt like days. He was exhausted, but no longer weighed down by fear. He looked at her. She was watching the flames, blinking slowly, blanket pulled close. A little girl, a grown woman, both, and still his. He didn't say anything else, didn't push for more, didn't ask for absolution. He just let her be, and for the first time since she left, she let him stay. Outside, the wind had picked up. Waves collided in the distance, reaching the edge of the cliffs below. Trees bent under pressure, and leaves slammed against the old windows like knocking fists. Kyle stood in the doorway of the cabin, watching the sky darken from gray to charcoal. It reminded him of a night he once spent alone in his Manhattan office, staring out at the skyline, weighed down by everything he couldn't say. Except this time, he wasn't hiding from his choices. He was living inside their consequence. Inside the cabin, the fire was beginning to die down. Nova stirred on the couch, waking slowly. Her eyes landed on Kyle, but she didn't speak. He didn't expect her to. Some things had to be offered, not asked for. He moved to the fireplace, carefully adding 2 more logs. The soft crackle returned. "I'm not going back yet," he said, not turning around. "Not until I've said what I came to say." Nova remained quiet, arms folded under the blanket. Kyle sat on the floor, facing the fire, the same way he used to when he was young, hiding in corners of rooms too large for comfort. "I've told you parts of the story," he began, "but not all of it. And maybe you already figured some of it out, or maybe you stopped caring. Either way, I need to say it." Nova adjusted the blanket slightly but didn't interrupt. "I was 21 when you were born. I wasn't rich yet. I wasn't ready. But I held you in my arms and knew that nothing in my life would mean more." He closed his eyes. "People tried to convince me otherwise. Said I'd ruin my chances, stain the family image, lose everything before I even started." He looked up at her now. "They were wrong. I lost everything when I started believing them." Nova didn't move, but her expression shifted. Slightly. Kyle pressed on, voice softening. "I thought I could keep you safe by keeping you secret. I told myself I was sparing you from scrutiny, from being pulled into a world that could chew us both up." He ran a hand over his face. "The truth is, I was scared they'd take you away. Scared I wasn't enough. Scared you'd grow up resenting me if I dragged you through my mess." A bitter smile tugged at his lips. "And instead, I created a different kind of mess. One where you never had a name people could call out loud." He looked directly at her. "I'm sorry." Nova's eyes glistened, but she blinked them dry. She sat up straighter, pulling the blanket tighter. "You let me grow up invisible." Kyle nodded. "I did. You watched me wave at you from school courtyards and kept walking like I was no one." He nodded again. "Yes." Her voice rose slightly. "You told me I was your world, but I was never allowed to exist in yours." Kyle didn't defend himself, didn't shift the blame. He just let her speak, because finally, she was being heard without filter, without softening the edges. "I used to watch the news when I knew your company had a press conference," she continued, "hoping one day someone would ask about your family, and you'd say my name." Kyle lowered his head. "I had a sentence rehearsed," Nova said, her voice breaking for the first time. "For the day you finally told someone about me, I had a sentence." "Can you believe that?" She laughed once, but it wasn't joy. It was exhaustion. Kyle looked at her again. "I can believe it, because I used to rehearse how I'd explain everything to you someday, and every time I practiced it, I made myself sound like a better man than I was." Nova stared at him. "Hard. Say it now," she whispered. Kyle inhaled, steady and slow. Then, with no script, no rehearsal, he said it. "I was a coward, not because I didn't love you, but because I did, so deeply it scared me. I thought if anyone else knew about you, they'd try to take you, and I couldn't handle that. So I built a wall, and I put both of us on opposite sides of it." He leaned forward. "I failed you, Nova. I failed you where it mattered most, not in what I gave you, but in what I withheld, a name, a place, a truth." Nova blinked hard. He continued, voice cracking. "I came here not to be forgiven, but to tell you I see you now, not just as a memory I kept safe in secret, but as someone who deserved to be seen out loud. From the beginning." She didn't respond right away, but she didn't look away either. Her fingers traced the edge of the blanket, and Kyle, for the first time, saw the wall begin to shift. Nova stood and walked toward the fireplace, then sat on the floor across from him, cross-legged, just like she used to sit when she was a child and wanted to be noticed. But tonight, she wasn't asking for attention. She was offering presence. Her voice was low, not trembling, just measured. "I used to think love meant not being left behind." Kyle sat still, listening. Nova continued. "I watched other kids get picked up by parents who had their arms wide open, who didn't flinch when someone called them mom or dad in public." She paused, glancing at him. "You never let me call you that where anyone could hear." Kyle's jaw tightened. "I wanted to," he said quietly. "I know," she replied, then added, but I still waited for the day you'd say it back. The firelight danced on her face now. Her eyes weren't angry anymore. They were tired, open, real. I stopped celebrating my birthday when I turned 12, she said. Kyle looked up. You always sent gifts, cards, once even a video message. But they arrived through strangers, in blank envelopes. They came with more caution than joy. She pressed her palm to her chest. It started to feel like I was a threat to your success, like you could only love me as long as no one knew I existed. Kyle's response was quiet. You weren't a threat. You were the only thing I was proud of. Nova turned to him sharply. Then why didn't you fight harder for me to be known? He held her gaze. Because I didn't know how to live with the noise, and I chose silence. That answer didn't heal everything. But it was honest. Nova's breath caught. She lowered her eyes, then said something he didn't expect. I still have every letter you wrote. Kyle blinked. The ones from boarding school? He asked. All of them. She stood and walked to the narrow dresser in the corner, pulled open a drawer, returned with a worn leather pouch. Inside were dozens of folded notes, some handwritten, some typed. All of them signed with a single K. Nova handed it over, then knelt beside him. I read them when I felt alone. I told myself the version of you in these letters was the real one. Kyle opened one gently. The ink was faded, but legible. You are not alone, Nova. You are never forgotten. Even if I can't show up today, know that I'm always choosing you, in the ways I still can. He swallowed hard. I never deserved your belief in me, he whispered. You almost lost it, she replied. But some part of me kept hoping the man who wrote those letters still existed. The silence between them stretched, but this time it was full of memory, not avoidance. Nova leaned her head slightly against the edge of the couch. Kyle turned toward the fire, then back to her. I want to change everything, he said. Not just how I treat you, but how I built my life around caution and reputation. I want to break that, for good. She didn't stop him. He pressed forward. I don't expect this to fix overnight. I don't expect you to move back, or meet your brother tomorrow, or pretend like this didn't scar you. Nova's brow softened. But I want you to know this, he said. From this point forward, your name will never be whispered again. If you choose to carry mine or choose a new one, I'll honor it, and I'll speak it. He reached into his jacket and pulled out something small. A necklace. Silver. Simple. At its center, a charm carved into the shape of an open door. Nova reached for it slowly. Kyle offered it without pushing. It's not a symbol of guilt, he said. It's a promise. My life and my world are no longer closed to you. She turned it in her hand, staring at the door charm. Then she looked up. Voice hushed. Why now? Kyle answered honestly. Because losing you finally hurt more than the fear of being seen. Nova looked at him for a long time. And finally, she nodded. Not an agreement to forget. Not a resolution, but a shared truth. A new start. Kyle sat back on the rug, breath slow, shoulders relaxed for the first time in years. Nova looked at the necklace once more and didn't let go. The fire had burned down again, leaving only orange embers tucked deep in ash. Kyle sat back against the wall now, legs stretched, his suit jacket folded on a nearby chair. He looked tired, but lighter, as if the weight he carried for years had finally shifted from shame to choice. Nova still held the necklace in her hand. She hadn't put it on. She hadn't returned it either. She sat on the couch with her legs tucked beneath her, knees drawn in, fingers still brushing over the tiny open door charm. Do you think people can start again? She asked quietly, eyes fixed on the flickering coals. Kyle looked over. Yes, but only if they stopped pretending they didn't mess up the first time. Nova let that settle, then asked, will you tell him about me? Your son? Kyle's voice was steady. Yes. Not when he's older, not as a footnote. From the beginning. Nova nodded. A small sound escaped her lips, somewhere between a sigh and a laugh. Not bitter, just surprised at how much those words settled something deep. She reached for the chain again, then finally placed it around her neck. Kyle didn't speak. He just watched, eyes brimming but still. Nova leaned back into the couch, her voice calmer than it had been all night. I don't know if I'm ready to come back with you yet, she said. You don't have to be, but I want to paint again. In the city. This time, not under a different name. Kyle smiled faintly. You'd still be you, no matter what name you chose. Nova blinked down at her hands, then whispered something almost to herself. Maybe it's time I decide what that name is. Kyle nodded slowly, then added, whatever you choose, I'll be there to speak it. Out loud, in front of anyone. She looked up, eyes wet, bottom lip trembling just enough. And for the first time since she'd found the cabin, she got off the couch not to retreat, but to come closer. She knelt in front of him. He didn't move, didn't dare breathe. Then, slowly, she leaned in and wrapped her arms around him. It wasn't tentative. It wasn't polite. It was real. A hug that shook both of them. One that cracked open all the years lost and let something alive fall in between. Kyle hugged her back, not like a father trying to hold on to something broken, but like a man finally being given another chance to love without hiding. She wept quietly. So did he. No words, just the sound of breath, of trembling relief, of one heart finding another again. Minutes passed like that, and when they finally pulled away, Kyle didn't ask anything more of her. He didn't beg for promises or decisions. He simply said, I'll be here. If you want to paint your own name, I'll be here. Nova looked at him, still holding onto the edges of the necklace, then nodded once, not just at him, at herself, at the girl she had been and the woman she was becoming. Outside, the wind had calmed. Inside, the fire gave one final pop before settling into silence. And for the first time in a long, long while, there was nothing left to hide. The child arrived quietly. No dramatic wail, just a soft exhale, a small clenched fist curling in Kyle's hand as he stood beside Isolde in the hospital room. She was tired, eyes half-lidded but glowing in a way only someone who had carried life inside her could glow. They had named him Elias, not after anyone in the family, a name that meant new beginning. Isolde turned her head, whispering, He has your eyes. Kyle looked down at the newborn. All the steel in his posture, the businessman, the strategist, the son who once bowed to expectations, melted. I just hope he inherits your strength, he whispered back. 2 weeks passed before Nova agreed to visit. She didn't arrive with fanfare. No one opened the door dramatically. She just walked in, jacket zipped high, hair pulled into a loose knot, clutching a paper bag that held a simple gift, a sketch she had made of Elias based on a photo Kyle sent. Isolde greeted her at the door. Not cold, not overly warm, just present. Hi, Isolde said, adjusting the baby in her arms. Nova's lips parted as if to say more, but the words didn't arrive. So she just said, Hi. They stood like that for a beat. Then Isolde did something neither of them expected. She held Elias out gently and said, Would you like to hold him? Nova froze. I don't want to drop him. You won't, Isolde replied. The baby, as if sensing the shift, cooed softly. Nova stepped forward. Her arms folded the way the nurse had shown her when she was practicing for an art project involving newborns. Elias settled in easily. Warmth, soft weight, new life. Kyle watched from across the room, silent. Isolde took a seat nearby. No instructions, no corrections, just observation. They didn't speak much that first visit, but something passed between them. A shared gaze, quiet acknowledgement, and for the first time, the air wasn't thick with unspoken tension. Days later, Nova received her acceptance letter. A prestigious art school in Manhattan. Scholarship attached. Kyle had spoken to no one on the board. He had made no calls. She applied on her own, and the work stood for itself. When he found the letter taped to his apartment door, Nova's simple note beside it read, You don't have to fight for my place anymore. I've claimed it myself. In that same week, Isolde announced the launch of a nonprofit foundation, The Light Between. It aimed to support children raised outside traditional structures, those in guardianship, kinship care, or adopted under private circumstances. During the press conference, she said, There are so many ways to build a family, and some of the most beautiful ones are born in silence, in sacrifice, and in second chances. Nova watched the speech online, paused it once, rewound it, watched again, not for the polish of Isolde's words, but for the weight behind them. Kyle stood in front of his boardroom just a month later. For the first time, no corporate jargon, no rehearsed buzzwords, just a man addressing the people who once told him to choose image over honesty. He didn't start with numbers. He began with truth, I've made choices in my life that protected this company, but cost me something deeper. I thought leadership meant image control, but I've learned that the most dangerous thing we can do, as people and as organizations, is to confuse silence with strategy. There were murmurs, raised brows. He continued, "Transparency isn't weakness, it's leadership. And from this day forward, Rivenhart Industries will implement family-first policies that don't punish complexity. Whether you raise a child alone, adopt in private, or carry the scars of non-traditional beginnings, you will never again be asked to choose between love and legacy under my leadership." The room was still. A few clapped, not because they had to, but because truth, especially when it's rare, has its own weight. That night, Kyle returned home to a small apartment, smaller than his penthouse. He'd traded it after everything began to shift, not as a penance, just a reset. Nova came over for dinner. She brought a canvas roll, teasing him not to peek. Isolde joined with Elias wrapped snug on her chest. The three of them ate pasta at the small kitchen table. There was laughter, not loud, not forced, but real. Elias gurgled at the sound of Nova's laugh. She smiled at him, saying, "That's the first time he's ever liked one of my jokes." Isolde grinned, passing a napkin. "Maybe he has taste." Kyle chuckled. No tension, no perfect harmony either, but peace. A real one. Before they left, Nova unrolled the canvas. It was a painting of the three of them, not posed, not formal. Just sitting on the couch, a baby between them, Kyle mid-laugh, Isolde reaching for Nova's hand. And in the corner, signed with a name, Nova Kaleson. She looked at her father, then at Isolde. "I figured it's time I gave myself a last name, one that holds all of this, the joy, the pain, the choice." Kyle didn't speak. He just reached for her hand. Isolde placed her free hand over theirs. Nothing needed saying, not anymore. As the scene fades, Kyle's voice narrates over soft strings. "I once believed love had to be protected from the world, hidden to keep it from being damaged. But I know better now. Love was never meant to be hidden. It was meant to be shared." If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, share it with someone who needs healing, and leave a comment below. Let's grow this family together.